For half a century, in symphony, ballet, song, and opera, he has written music which is distinctly American, music which can sing of wide open spaces, of farms and folk communities, of prairies and mountains. For half a century, he has been America's most acclaimed composer. This is a portrait of the man and his music, a portrait of Aaron Copland.
You know, everybody likes to leave some trace of themselves. My main purpose in writing the autobiography would be to tell the story of the development of American music as I lived it. I was fortunate enough to come along in the 20s at a time when the whole field of American music was picking up. There were many more composers than had been in the 1890s, and I got to know a great many of them personally. So that since I've lived through 50 years of American musical history, it seemed to me worthwhile to try and get down on paper the essence of what my experience had been. I was born in Brooklyn in November of 1900. My family was not terribly musical. I don't think it would show any musicians or any painters or writers. My father had what was considered to be the large department store of that area, sort of a small version of Macy's. I get surprised when I recall that a composer was born on that street, because I wouldn't have picked it as a likely place for a composer to come into the world. And I remember when I talked to my father about wanting to become a composer, he said to me, "Where did you get such a strange idea?" And I really don't know where I got it from. I just found myself naturally moving toward the piano after school hours and fiddling around with some notes. You know, it's difficult to think back to more than 50 years ago and try to remember just how it felt to be starting off on such a chancy profession, if you can call it that, of being a composer of serious music. I knew all about jazz composers, of course. In those days they were called ragtime composers. But I was interested in writing in music like well, you know, like Chopin, or like Debussy, or later on like Stravinsky. That is to say, a more sophisticated and a serious kind of music. And there was no guarantee, of course, that what I would write would have any particular significance, except my own inner feeling that what I was writing seemed very important to me. It was expressing some inside notion I had of what I wanted to express in terms of music, and that fascinated me. I remember my piano teacher asked me to play the piano at his student concert, which he gave at Wanamaker's department store. That was a pretty big time stuff. I mean, they had a real auditorium, and they had an afternoon audience. And I recall that when I made my debut in Wanamaker's, it's odd, isn't it, that I should have made my debut in a department store since I was brought up in a department store. Why, just before I went out on the stage, Mr. Wolfson, my teacher, started banging me around the ears and said, "Don't get nervous, don't get nervous." I wasn't a bit nervous, and I said, "What are you hitting me for?" Anyhow, I did go out and play Paderewski's Polonaise, I remember. But by that time, of course, I must have been 16 years old. And it was he who recommended a harmony teacher to me. And the harmony teacher was Mr. Reuben Goldmark, who had a studio on West 87th Street in Manhattan. That made a big shot, you see, out of him. He didn't come from Brooklyn. But it was in Paris where the new things in music of the early 20s were really happening. And of course, Paris was a center of excitement in all the arts. I can remember seeing James Joyce and Ernest Hemingway at the cafe where we'd go to get a drink. I roomed with Harold Clurman, who today is one of our leading lights in the theater as critic and director.
When I arrived in Paris, Aaron announced the first thing that he had sold his first piece of music, a piano piece called The Cat and the Mouse, for 500 francs, which at the time I think was worth about $35. But it wasn't a matter of $35 that exhilarated him so much, but the fact that there he was at the age of 21 or so, and he had already sold a piece of music to the most prominent French publisher. And shortly after, almost 2 or 3 days later, I went to Aaron Copland's concert, that is to say, a concert given by the School of Fontainebleau, at which Aaron had enrolled for the summer, and where he met his teacher, where he studied with his teacher, who was the teacher for the next 2 or 3 years, Nadia Boulanger.
I was greatly flattered when I was 23 years old, and Mademoiselle Boulanger had the courage to ask me to write an organ symphony for her. Later, I made a version of the same music without the organ and called it my first symphony.
I wrote home to my parents that I felt that this young man whom I had just met and whom I was barely acquainted with, although we had agreed to share an apartment, would be one day the leading composer of the United States. And I'm very happy that my prophecy, made at the age of 20 or 21, was an accurate one.
When I came back from my studies in Paris, I was rather preoccupied with the idea of trying to write a music which would be recognizably American, in the sense that America has its own kind of civilization, its own feelings about life, and we hadn't really developed composers of general significance who were able to reflect that kind of feeling and that kind of life. I'm not much of an outdoors man. I've never been on the back of a horse. It always seemed to be a very strange place to be. As a young man, I was writing music that was considered quite avant-garde, and it was customary for the critics to be of a more conservative stripe. One sort of expected that one's new piece would not be well received. You expected to have it slammed and said to be over-advanced in idiom, and we couldn't make any sense out of it. I had very bad reviews on some pieces which are now very well accepted. And you sort of take that in your stride. It was a dream of Serge Koussevitzky, who was then head of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, to establish a summer school for American music students. And he asked me to head the composition department during a period of, well, 25 years. The excitement of the young people who came there was really something to live with. Recently, I returned to Tanglewood in order to help celebrate the centennial of the birth of Serge Koussevitzky. My old friend Victor Kraft was with me, and I met many old composer friends and the younger students. To me, it's very mysterious nowadays. It's exactly the proportion of music written for played instruments and for the need for electronical support of various kinds. I always enjoy talking to young composers. The newest generation are interested in certain phases of musical creativity which didn't really exist when we began Tanglewood. I'm thinking now of the electronic media. And we were talking about the limitations of music that had to be played on tape. Does anybody do live electronic music so that it's different each time?
Yeah.
Yes? Who does that? I wasn't aware of that.
Stockhausen's been very interested.
Has he?
Yeah.
Playing it like you would a piano, so to speak.
Yeah, he has to use less sophisticated equipment.
I see. I used to see Stravinsky, of course, in Paris before he ever came here in the 20s. And the premieres of things done there, even Koussevitzky used to give concerts in Paris, too, were terribly exciting events. We were all very head up about it. Schoenberg came a bit later, maybe 10 years later. Here we go.
Gather round and listen to the story of the promised land and the promised glory. You don't need to tears, you have no money, you don't need no daring to buy your milk and honey. There you ride in style, horse with 4 white horses, there the evening meal, and 1, 2, 3, 4 courses.
Another young and very gifted musician who was at Tanglewood was Michael Tilson Thomas, the conductor.
He is one of those very great people who is a great humanist in that long and great tradition. He's very involved with people, with his family and with friends and with musicians, and indeed that's all involved with his music. His music, for me, of course I grew up with it, has a very special feeling because it's the music of a time when people in this country really believed in all those great American ideals that in my generation we've come to sorrow over. And he's in a period of very, very great victory now, because all the people who said that his music was old-fashioned now are discovering that in fact their music is the music that is of the recent past, that is old-fashioned, that is passé, that is full of many, many cliches. And suddenly we're hearing again this wonderful concept of line and of expression and of color, and we're hearing Aaron. He has a sound, he has a voice, and it's a very important voice to all of us.
One generally works with ideas. You have to get musical nuggets which set you off. You rarely would have an idea for a composition just in the vague. It generally takes a specific form of either a melodic idea, a harmonic idea, a rhythmic idea, something that seems full of possibilities for development. And once you get enough of those together, that's the way I work anyhow, generally the larger form begins to suggest itself. And the great day comes when everything seems to run to its place without you doing anything about it. It's just naturally the one idea follows another. And then there'll always be the spots where they don't connect and where you have to really sit down and work to make the connection and seem natural, so that no one will be able to tell when they hear the piece where your inspiration, so to speak, stopped and your hard work began. It's just about 50 years since I wrote my first symphony, and I was invited to perform it when I gave a concert with the National Symphony at Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. Brass at 9. Yatta, tata. Very commanding. Hit it. More trumpet, more. Yeah. The tone is a little too fat. Da, 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 dee, da. Try and give it a jazz quality if you can. 3, please. 3. And could you give it a little more bite? You're playing it too peacefully. Da 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 da. Ya da 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 da. Should grow by itself without any effort on your part, so to speak. It's growing. First Symphony was considered to be very far out, very modernistic, as they would have said in those days. As a matter of fact, after the first performance was over, the conductor, Walter Damrosch, turned to the audience and said, if a young man at the age of 23 can write a work like this, in 5 years he'll be ready to commit murder. Of course, the public laughed, and I laughed with them. Naturally, I get a feeling of great satisfaction at having been able to work during my lifetime at an art which fascinated me and gave me the sense that I was accomplishing the thing that I had set out to do. It wasn't as if we were simply adding to what America had already done. I was part of a whole new development, exploring new territory.